Hello. Tonight we explore the genuine Wild West, not Hollywood's tale of heroic cowboys and dramatic duels, but the rugged, unsafe reality where living was never certain. You may feel you're strong enough for it, but believe me, it was called wild for good reason. If you like these narratives, a quick like or a subscribe would be fantastic. It truly helps. I'm always interested to know where you're listening, so comment with your location and current time. It's wonderful seeing our small worldwide audience connect via these narratives. Now, lower the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let us settle into this evening's exploration together. We are about to discover why you might not last even one day on the untamed American frontier. Well done. You have just awakened in the American Wild West of the 1870s. The positive side. You are about to witness a legendary historical period firsthand. The negative side. Your prospects for survival have just plummeted constantly. The initial obstacle confronts you even before you open your eyes. The odor not the earthy, agreeable scent of nature you might anticipate, but something considerably more acrid. The reek of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and what could very well be raw sewage permeating the air. You see, hygiene wasn't precisely a top concern in the Wild West. Most pioneers viewed a complete wash as a monthly indulgence, and that's putting it mildly. Some endured entire winters without a decent bath. Water, as you know, was a precious commodity out here, and using it for personal cleanliness seemed profligate when it was essential for drinking and cooking. As you pull yourself from your bed, likely just a straw-stuffed mattress teeming with bedbugs, you become aware of how every muscle in your body protests. Life on the 1870s frontier entailed relentless physical exertion from sunrise to sunset. There were no weekends, no holidays, and certainly no ergonomic design. Whether you were a tiller of the soil, a digger for minerals, or a ranch worker, your physique was your main instrument, utilized until it failed. You might believe your modern life involves hard work, but frontier toil was an entirely different beast's back-breaking labor that left even the most robust individuals permanently stooped and arthritic by their 30s. Picture spending 14 hours plowing, fetching water, felling trees, or laboring deep in a mine. It's no surprise the average life expectancy was merely around 35 years. Standing on the earthen floor, you sense the coolness in the atmosphere. If it's winter, your dwelling might be 20 degrees below freezing indoors. If you possessed a fireplace, you would have let it die down overnight to conserve valuable fuel. Best of luck finding central heating or thermal garments in this era. And if it's summer, well, prepare to perspire through every item of clothing you possess. There was no eluding the elements in the Wild West. Regarding attire, forget ease. Men typically possessed perhaps 2 changes of clothes, coarse canvas or denim trousers and cotton shirts that irritated the skin. Women wore numerous layers, irrespective of the heat. Chemises, corsets, petticoats, and long dresses that swept the ground. Everything was abrasive, ill-fitting, and seldom laundered. Those elegant outfits depicted in Western films. Pure fantasy for the common individual. Your stomach rumbles, signaling it's time for breakfast. Hope you enjoy beans, biscuits, and coffee, quite possibly for every single meal. The Wild West diet was repetitive and nutritionally inadequate. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal. Treats, meat, when procurable, was frequently preserved with salt or smoke, since air refrigeration was non-existent. Scurvy, an ailment resulting from vitamin C deficiency. You know, when your gums bleed and teeth loosen, was prevalent among settlers, despite being easily avoidable with current knowledge. You might assume the coffee, at least, would be decent. Cowboys always seem to have a pot on the go in movies, but what you're offered scarcely resembles what you'd identify as coffee. It's usually boiled to near oblivion, unbelievably bitter, and might contain crushed eggshells or even salt to lessen bitterness. Nevertheless, The caffeine would aid you in confronting the day, so you consume it without objection. Before venturing outdoors, you might want to inspect your footwear for scorpions or snakes that could have taken refuge during the night. It wasn't unusual for frontier inhabitants to shake out their boots each morning, a practice born from painful encounters. One misstep and you could be dealing with a venomous bite, miles from any medical assistance. Emerging from your cabin, you're instantly conscious of your vulnerability. The immense panorama off the American frontier was undoubtedly uninspiring, but it was also relentless. Severe weather could materialize with scant warning. Blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, or droughts could all signify death for the ill-prepared. The sky might be clear at present, but that could alter in moments. If you've taken up residence in a frontier town, you might suppose civilization provides some measure of safety. In certain respects, that's accurate. In others, it merely introduces alternative perils. Towns in the Wild West were breeding grounds for disease. Lacking proper sanitation systems or an understanding germ theory, illnesses spread swiftly through communities. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were persistent dangers. An epidemic could decimate half a town within weeks. Regarding towns, let's imagine you opt to visit one today. As you draw near, you observe a distinct absence of the orderly arrangement you might anticipate. Many Western towns developed with structures erected wherever convenient, frequently without adequate planning or infrastructure. The streets aren't paved but are instead dirt paths that become muddy quagmires in rain and dust bowls in dry spells. The odor assails you once more potent now. Horse manure is ubiquitous because horses are the primary mode of transport. There are no street sweepers or sanitation crews. In some towns, the accumulated refuse could be knee-high in busy zones. Flies buzz around you, and you grasp why disease proliferates so readily here. As you stroll along the main thoroughfare, you pass the saloon, likely among the most bustling establishments in town. Contrary to cinematic portrayals, saloons weren't sophisticated venues with swinging doors and piano melodies. Most were rudimentary, single-room operations with rough plank bars and Spartan furnishings. The spirits served weren't fine whiskey, aged in oak, but raw alcohol often adulterated with tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder to impart an extra jolt. A single draught could render you blind if misfortune struck. The saloon epitomizes another lethal facet of frontier existence, violence. These places were frequently the scenes of fatal clashes, not due to formal duels or showdowns, but because of drunken quarrels that escalated rapidly in a heavily armed populace. The romanticized gun battles of Western movies were infrequent. Most violence was impulsive, chaotic, and stemmed from trivial disagreements. Concerning being armed, you'll note nearly everyone carries a weapon of some sort, but not for the reasons you might imagine. While self-defense was undoubtedly a consideration, weapons were chiefly instruments for hunting, protection from wild animals, and occasionally for signaling. The persistent menace from bears, wolves, cougars, and venomous snakes made venturing unarmed unwise, particularly when journeying between settlements. You might be astonished to discover that many frontier towns actually enforced strict firearm regulations. Locations like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, mandated that visitors relinquish their weapons upon entering town boundaries. The renowned gunfight at the OK Corral actually began because the Clanton faction refused to adhere to Tombstone's weapons ordinance. Despite cinematic depictions, quick-draw duels in the street's center were exceptionally uncommon. Most shootings were ambushes or occurred during holdups. The skilled gunslinger confronting an adversary at high noon is largely a Hollywood fabrication. Authentic frontier violence was typically abrupt, disorganized, and devoid of any sense of honor or propriety. As you proceed with your walk, you pass the local physician's office. Medical attention on the 1870s frontier would appall you. Most doctors possessed little or no formal education. Surgical interventions were conducted without anesthesia beyond whiskey or morphine, and sterilization was practically unheard of. Something as minor as an infected abrasion could result in amputation or fatality. Prevalent treatments involved bloodletting, mercury-based compounds, arsenic, and other toxic agents that frequently caused more harm than benefit. Women in labor faced mortality rates as high as 1 in 4 in isolated regions. Dentistry entailed extraction without anesthesia using primitive instruments. Most individuals endure painful dental afflictions for years before ultimately losing their teeth. If you sustained an injury or fell sick on the frontier, your survival often hinged more on fortune than medical aid. Even slight injuries could become life-threatening due to infection. Fractured bones might never mend correctly, leaving frontier dwellers with persistent pain and impairment. The famous adage, "Only the strong survive," held literal significance. In the Wild West, your stomach rumbles once more, and you realize it's lunchtime. You'll make your way to the local eatery, which is probably just an annex of someone's residence, where meals are provided for a charge. The fare isn't any more diverse than your breakfast. Meat is tough and often tainted, despite aggressive smoking or salting. Vegetables, if on hand, are overcooked into a pulp. Food safety regulations are non-existent, so dysentery and food poisoning are frequent happenings. While dining, you overhear discussions about recent Indian raids, outlaw bans, or the perils of solitary travel. While Native American aggression against settlers was significantly less frequent than depicted in popular media and truth. Settlers and the U.S. military were far more apt to be the aggressors. The frontier remained a zone of conflict. The methodical displacement of indigenous populations bred tensions that occasionally flared into violence from both sides. Regarding outlaws, they posed a genuine menace, especially in secluded territories. Law enforcement was meager, with a lone sheriff sometimes overseeing thousands of square miles. In numerous locations, justice was administered via vigilante groups rather than formal legal channels. Lynch mobs were common, and the principle of innocent until proven guilty frequently did not hold. If you were accused of horse theft or cattle rustling, you might find yourself swinging from a branch before day's end, irrespective of your actual culpability or innocence. After your meal, you opt to visit the local general store to replenish your provisions. The prices astound you. Basic necessities command far higher prices on the frontier than back east owing to the difficulty and cost of transport. A mere can of peaches might equate to $20 in contemporary currency. Many settlers expended most of their earnings on vital supplies, with little remaining for comfort or indulgence. The store provides another insight into frontier actuality: isolation. Mail service was sporadic and undependable. Newspapers might be weeks or months outdated. Information disseminated slowly, and you might endure years without word from relatives. Back east, many settlers never reunited with their kin after migrating west. The psychological burden of this solitude contributed to elevated rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide among frontier inhabitants. As the afternoon progresses, you observe dark clouds amassing on the horizon. Weather on the frontier wasn't merely disagreeable, it could be lethal. Lacking modern forecasting, storms descended with little forewarning. Blizzards could leave travelers stranded, culminating in freezing deaths. Tornadoes obliterated entire communities with no emergency aid for survivors. Flash floods swept away wagon caravans. Droughts decimated crops and induced starvation. If you were fortunate enough to possess a proper dwelling, it offered scant protection. Most frontier abodes were hastily erected from whatever materials were at hand. Sod houses on the plains, log cabins in wooded areas, or simple timber structures in towns. None were notably effective against severe weather. Winter temperatures inside could plummet below freezing. Summer heat was often intolerable, particularly in attics or upper levels where many people slept. As the tempest nears, you resolve to return to your cabin before it strikes. En route, you pass a group of men heading to work at the local mine. Mining was among the most lethal occupations on the frontier. Underground collapses, toxic gas inhalation, explosions from improperly handled blasting agents, and machinery mishaps claimed innumerable lives. Miners also endured long-term health problems like black lung from coal dust or mercury poisoning from gold extraction. Even if you avoided mining, few frontier jobs were safe. Farming involved hazardous machinery lacking safety mechanisms. Ranching entailed working with unpredictable animals weighing hundreds of pounds. Logging possessed one of the highest fatality rates of any profession. Whatever your livelihood, your risk of grave injury or death was exponentially greater than in the modern era. You reach your cabin just as the downpour commences. The roof leaks in multiple spots, and you arrange buckets to collect the water. This presents a good chance to replenish your drinking supply. As clean water was scarce and valuable, many frontier settlers drank from the same sources used for washing and watering animals, resulting in waterborne diseases that could swiftly prove fatal. As you sit in your leaky dwelling, listening to the rain, you contemplate how starkly reality differs from the romanticized depiction of the Wild West. There were no heroes or villains, merely individuals striving to survive under incredibly severe conditions. The very fact that anyone endured is a tribute to human fortitude and resolve. Night descends early, since you lack electricity. Candles and oil lamps offer scant light, and you handle them with care. Fire posed a continual threat in frontier homes. A single ember could mean losing everything, with no fire brigade to summon. Many towns incinerated completely at least once during their existence. You ready yourself for bed, weary from just a single day in the Wild West. Your muscles ache, your stomach is squizzy from the unaccustomed food, and your mind is taxed by the constant alertness needed to remain alive. As you drift into slumber, you ponder whether you'll survive tomorrow or become just another entry in the perilous saga of the American frontier. The wind moans outside your cabin, a chilling reminder of humanity's smallness and fragility against the vast, untamed wilderness. Tomorrow, should you be fortunate enough to witness it, will reintroduce all these trials, along with new ones you have not yet conceived. In the Wild West, survival was never assured. It was earned daily, hourly, through tribulations most modern individuals can barely imagine. The morning light seeps through the gaps in your cabin walls, rousing you from a fitful sleep. Your body aches from the unforgiving mattress, but there's no time for delay. The Wild West doesn't pause for anyone. As you get up, you recall yesterday's harsh initiation into frontier existence and wonder what fresh difficulties today might present. Let's assume you opt to depart town today to traverse the frontier. Whether you're bound for another settlement, joining a wagon train westward, or merely exploring, travel in the 1870s was an entirely different affair than what you're familiar with. The upside is that by this period, the Transcontinental Railroad was complete, linking America's east and west coasts. The downside, unless you were fairly affluent or journeying between major urban centers, you likely couldn't afford its use. Most frontier denizens traveled by horse, wagon, or simply by foot. If you possessed a horse, count yourself lucky. Horses were costly to acquire and upkeep, placing them beyond the means of many settlers. A decent horse might cost the equivalent of several months' earnings. Then you required saddles, bridles, fodder, and veterinary services. Though veterinary care often meant dispatching the animal if it broke a limb or contracted certain ailments, riding itself was no leisurely excursion. Saddles in the 1870s were not engineered for comfort, but for utility. Hours in the saddle left even seasoned riders with blisters and sore muscles. And if your horse shied at a snake or an unexpected sound, a frequent occurrence, you could easily be unseated, potentially sustaining broken bones or worse, miles from any assistance. If you couldn't afford a horse, you might travel by wagon. Dismiss the romantic notion of pioneers blithely traversing pristine prairies. Wagon travel was brutally uncomfortable. The vehicles lacked any suspension system beyond the minimal flexibility of wooden wheels, meaning you experienced every stone, rut, and depression in the path. The incessant jolting induced wagon sickness, akin to seasickness, leaving travelers nauseated and wretched. Roads, if they existed at all, were typically mere dirt tracks forged by previous travelers. After rain, they transformed into muddy bogs, where wagons could become mired axle deep. During dry spells, the dust was so dense you could scarcely breathe or see. Wagons frequently suffered breakdowns, with wheels cracking or axles fracturing. Miles from the close settlement, let's imagine you've chosen to journey all the way to California or Oregon. You've joined a wagon train heading west on the renowned Oregon Trail. This 2,000-mile trek was among the most hazardous endeavors of the 19th century. Of the roughly 400,000 individuals who undertook it between the 1840s and 1860s, an estimated 1 in 10 did not make it. The Oregon Trail was sometimes dubbed the nation's longest cemetery. Some historians approximate that an average of 10 to 15 people perished for every mile of the trail. Contemplate that. A grave every 350 feet or so for 2,000 miles. The trail was dotted with makeshift crosses and stone markers, many unmarked. As families were compelled to inter loved ones and press on with their journey, disease was the foremost killer on the Oregon Trail. Cholera, a bacterial infection transmitted through contaminated water, was especially ruinous. This dreadful malady, induced severe diarrhea and vomiting, depleting the body of fluids so rapidly that a person could be healthy at breakfast and deceased by dinner time. There was no effective remedy available. Wagon trains would sometimes lose dozens of individuals in a single cholera epidemic. Other ailments, like dysentery, typhoid, and mountain fever, claimed countless lives. Children were particularly susceptible, with many families losing multiple offspring during the trek. Medical attention was rudimentary at best, often comprising folk treatments that offered little help and sometimes exacerbated conditions. Fording rivers posed another lethal challenge. Wagons weren't built to float, but pioneers had to navigate numerous rivers on their westward journey. Some had ferries or shallow crossings, but many necessitated floating the wagon across like a makeshift raft. Wagons frequently overturned during these crossings, drowning people and livestock and ruining precious supplies. The Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers claimed hundreds of lives throughout the migration era. Contrary to widespread belief, attacks by Native Americans were comparatively infrequent. Most tribes were actually supportive of migrants, providing supplies, direction, and aid with river crossings. The bulk of violent deaths on the trail resulted from accidents, being crushed by wagon wheels, drowning, or being kicked by draft animals. Firearms mishaps were alarmingly common, as most travelers were unskilled with weapons but carried them for hunting and defense. The psychological burden of the journey was immense. Families interred children, parents, and spouses along the route, then had to resume travel immediately. There was no opportunity for prolonged mourning on the trail. Each day's postponement meant a reducence of traversing the mountains before winter snows rendered passes impassable. The unceasing stress, sorrow, and physical hardship drove many travelers to mental collapse. Suicide was not unheard of among trail migrants. If you somehow endured the journey to California or Oregon, your difficulties were not concluded. Many reached their destination having exhausted all their funds and resources on the journey itself. Families often arrived impoverished, malnourished, and unwell, only to discover that the promised land presented its own savior realities. But let's say you've opted not to travel so extensively. Perhaps you're heading to a nearby town or settlement instead. Even brief journeys in the Wild West posed considerable dangers. Travelers might encounter outlaws who viewed lone riders or small parties as vulnerable targets. While the incidence of stagecoach robberies was overstated in later fiction, they happened regularly enough to be a genuine worry. The natural surroundings presented constant menaces to travelers. Flash floods could obliterate trails or ensnare wary travelers. Summer heat in desert areas could kill through dehydration and heat stroke. Winter blizzards routinely trapped travelers, sometimes leading to freezing deaths or dire situations like the infamous Donner Party, where survivors resorted to cannibalism to survive. Navigation itself was demanding in an era preceding detailed maps. Travelers depended on ambiguous directions, landmarks that could shift or be misidentified, and the expertise of guides who occasionally proved unreliable. Getting lost in the wilderness could be a death sentence, particularly if your supplies dwindled. As you journey today, you observe another facet of frontier life that movies seldom portray accurately: the astounding diversity of people. The Wild West wasn't solely populated by white cowboys and settlers. It was a confluence of cultures from across the globe. Chinese immigrants labored as railroad constructors, miners, and merchants. Mexican families had inhabited the Southwest. Long before it became U.S. territory, black cowboys constituted as much as 25% of the workforce on some ranches. European immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and Scandinavia contributed their cultures and traditions. And, naturally, dozens of distinct Native American nations had regarded these lands as home for millennia before others arrived. This diversity, however, did not equate to equality or concord. Racial violence was a prevalent characteristic of frontier existence. Chinese railroad workers endured brutal discrimination and were frequently compelled to undertake the most perilous for lower wages than white laborers. Mexican landowners often witnessed their property confiscated through legal chicanery or outright appropriation after the Mexican-American War. Black Americans who migrated west, aspiring to escape Southern discrimination, frequently found frontier racism just as pervasive, albeit different in its manifestation. Despite their vital contributions to ranching, mining, and constructing frontier communities, they were commonly barred from economic prospects and social inclusion. For Native Americans, the advance of white settlement was nothing short of a calamity. The indigenous population of North America, once estimated at perhaps 15 million, had dwindled to fewer than 300,000 by 1900. Disease, warfare, forced displacement, and the intentional annihilation of their food sources, notably the buffalo, decimated numerous tribes and nations. U.S. government policies systematically evicted Native Americans from their ancestral lands onto reservations, often in regions with infertile soil and meager resources. Treaties were routinely violated when valuable resources were found on reservation territories. Native children were taken from their families and placed in boarding schools intended to obliterate their cultural heritage, operating under the tenet of kill the Indian, save the man. The romanticized cowboys versus Indians narratives of subsequent films grossly distorted the intricate interactions between settlers and indigenous peoples. Many native nations initially sought to accommodate newcomers and adjust to evolving circumstances. Violence typically erupted following repeated treaty infringements, incursions on tribal lands, or deliberate incitements. As you continue your trek, you consider another group whose experience contrasted sharply with Hollywood portrayals: women on the frontier. Far from the defenseless maidens or schoolmarms of Western movies, frontier women undertook incredibly arduous physical labor while contending with restrictive societal norms. On homesteads and farms, women not only managed traditional domestic responsibilities like cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, and garment making, but also toiled in the fields, cared for livestock, and defended the home when required. Their workday typically commenced before sunrise and concluded long after sunset, with few, if any, days of respite. A frontier woman might need to plow fields in the morning, assist with a neighbor's childbirth at noon, fend off predators menacing the livestock in the afternoon, and still prepare meals and look after her own children throughout. Many women became widows at a young age due to the perilous nature of frontier existence and had to manage farms or businesses single-handedly while raising children. Despite their crucial contributions, women possessed few legal entitlements. In most territories and states, they could not vote, own property independently if married, or gain custody of their children in case of divorce. Domestic abuse was deemed a private concern with little legal aid available to victims. For unmarried women, choices were severely restricted. Teaching was one of the few respectable occupations, though female educators were paid considerably less than their male peers, and were often obliged to resign upon marriage. Some women achieved economic autonomy by operating boarding houses, serving as nurses, or founding millinery or dressmaking enterprises. A few territories, like Wyoming and Utah, conferred voting rights upon women decades before the 19th Amendment, acknowledging their vital contributions to frontier progress. As the day progresses and you continue your travels, you might reflect on law enforcement in this supposedly ungoverned land. The actuality was intricate and varied significantly by location. Major cities and towns typically possessed some form of organized law enforcement, but extensive rural regions had minimal, if any, official safeguarding. County sheriffs were elected officials tasked with upholding order across sometimes vast territories. A lone sheriff might be the sole law enforcement for thousands of square miles, rendering regular patrols unfeasible. They depended heavily on deputizing ordinary citizens during crises, forming posses to hunt criminals or address violence. Town marshals managed law enforcement within town boundaries, occasionally with a few deputies in larger settlements. These roles were often perilous and poorly compensated, attracting a combination of committed public servants and those who relished the authority the badge conferred. Some renowned lawmen like Wyatt Earp transitioned between legitimate law enforcement and more dubious ventures throughout their careers. Federal marshals possessed jurisdiction across territories and states but were scarce. They typically concentrated on significant crimes like counterfeiting, mail theft, or offenses spanning multiple jurisdictions. The legendary U.S. Marshals of Western movies, single-handedly imposing law on lawless towns, were largely fictional inventions. In many secluded areas, justice was administered through informal community measures rather than official legal procedures. Vigilante bands formed to tackle perceived threats when formal law enforcement was lacking or inefficient. Occasionally, these groups upheld basic order, but they could readily devolve into instruments of prejudice, personal vendettas, or mob rule. The iconic image of the quick-draw gunfight was largely a later fabrication. Most frontier violence was mundane, impulsive, and often bar brawls, that is scoletto, fatal outcomes, domestic violence, and disputes over land or livestock were far more prevalent than dramatic shootouts on dusty streets. Criminal retribution was severe by contemporary standards. Hanging was the customary penalty for murder, rape, and sometimes theft, particularly of horses or cattle. Prisons existed but were rudimentary facilities with high mortality rates from disease, violence, and poor conditions. Many communities favored immediate execution over the cost of lengthy incarceration. As evening draws near, you decide to find shelter for the night. If you're fortunate, you might locate a town with a hotel or boarding house. Don't anticipate opulence. Frontier lodgings were basic at best. A typical hotel room would feature a simple bed, possibly infested with bedbugs, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and perhaps a chair. Bathroom amenities would consist of an outhouse in the rear, shared by all patrons. Privacy was minimal, with flimsy walls allowing you to overhear your neighbor's every sound and conversation. In busier establishments, you might even share a bed with a stranger, a common practice to maximize occupancy during peak times. The linens might not have been laundered since the previous occupants, and illumination would be restricted to candles or oil lamps. A night's accommodation would cost between 25 cents and $1, contingent on the establishment's quality and location. This constituted a considerable expenditure for many travelers, equivalent to several hours' wages for an average laborer. Many opted to sleep in stables, barns, or simply outdoors to conserve money. Despite the added dangers these choices presented, if you were journeying through more isolated regions, you'd likely make camp for the night. This entailed building a fire, assuming you could locate sufficient fuel, preparing a meal from your meager supplies, and sleeping on the ground with minimal defense against the elements or wildlife. Indigenous peoples, seasoned travelers, and military scouts possessed sophisticated methods for safe camping, but the average settler often made perilous errors. Prudent fire management was literally a matter of survival. A fire built too large could ignite a prairie or forest blaze that could devour thousands of acres in hours. One built too small might not offer enough warmth on cold nights, leading to hypothermia. Campfire cooking demanded skills most modern individuals lack, frequently yielding meals that were simultaneously charred and uncooked. As night fully descends, and you prepare for slumber, the sounds of the frontier darkness envelope you. Coyotes yelp in the distance. Unfamiliar birds utter their calls. The wind rustles through grass or trees. For individuals accustomed to modern light and noise pollution, the profound blackness and strange sounds of wilderness nights often provoked intense unease. Many travelers slept poorly on the frontier, not merely due to physical discomfort, but from fear of the unknown perils that might conceal themselves in the darkness. Native attacks, though infrequent, often happened at dawn when sleepers were most vulnerable. Predators like wolves, bears, and mountain lions might scrutinize camps for food. Venomous snakes and scorpions sought warm resting places, sometimes including a sleeper's bedroll. Even if no actual threats emerged, the psychological duress of constant watchfulness took its toll. Frontier diaries frequently mention exhaustion, not just from physical toil, but from the mental exertion of perpetual alertness. Modern people accustomed to locks, alarms, and the safety of dense populations would find vulnerability of frontier sleeping arrangements deeply unsettling. As you drift toward sleep, you contemplate the day's journey. Travel in the Wild West bears almost no resemblance to its sanitized, romanticized portrayal in later entertainment. It was grueling, dangerous, and uncomfortable beyond what most modern people could endure. The skills required, from navigation without maps to making emergency repairs and handling firearms safely, took years to develop, and mistakes were often fatal. The darkness deepens, and the calls of nocturnal creatures grow louder. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. If you survive the night, perhaps you'll reach your destination, or perhaps you'll become just another unmarked grave along the trail, one more statistic in the perilous story of westward expansion. The Wild West forgave no weakness and offered no second chances. Every day survived was a victory against overwhelming odds. The new day dawns on the frontier, and you've somehow survived the night of victory in itself in the Wild West. As you rub the sleep from your eyes and stretch your aching muscles, you contemplate what direction your frontier experience might take today. Perhaps you'll try your luck in one of the booming mining towns where fortunes are supposedly made overnight. You've heard stories of the California gold rush, the Nevada silver strikes, and the Colorado mining booms. Tales of ordinary men finding nuggets the size of chicken eggs and becoming wealthy overnight have drawn hundreds of thousands west. What these stories don't mention are the brutal realities awaiting those who chase mineral dreams. Let's say you decide to try your hand at mining. What would that actually entail? First, you'd need to stake a claim, which means finding unclaimed land with potential mineral deposits increasingly difficult by the 1870s, as the easiest and richest areas were claimed years earlier. If you were lucky enough to find a promising spot, you'd need to register your claim at the nearest government office and pay the required fees, which could be Then the real work would begin, and it was some of the most physically demanding labor imaginable. For placer mining, searching for loose gold in streams, you'd spend hours bent over in ice-cold mountain water, sifting through sediment with a pan or sluice box. Your hands would crack and bleed from constant exposure to water and rough materials. Your back would ache from the hunched position. And after all that effort, you'd be lucky to find a few tiny flakes of gold worth pennies. If you ventured into hard rock mining, digging for veins of ore in the mountains, the dangers multiplied exponentially. Tunneling into unstable rock without modern safety equipment or engineering knowledge led to frequent cave-ins that crushed miners where they stood. Poorly ventilated shafts filled with toxic gases like carbon monoxide, odorless but deadly, suffocating miners who had no warning of the danger. Blasting with black powder or dynamite to break through rock was incredibly hazardous. Miners frequently lost fingers, hands, eyes, or lives when charges detonated prematurely or thrown rock fragments became deadly projectiles. The thunderous noise and constant percussion of blasting left many with permanent hearing loss. Even if you avoided immediate catastrophes, the long-term health effects were devastating. Miners constantly inhaled fine rock dust, leading to silicosis, a painful lung disease that slowly suffocated its victims. Mercury used in gold processing caused neurological damage, tremors, and mental deterioration. Those working in copper or lead mines absorbed toxic metals that accumulated in their bodies, causing chronic illness and early death. The mining industry of the 1870s had virtually no safety regulations or oversight. Mine owners prioritized profit over worker welfare, and injuries were considered an expected part of the job. Medical care for injured miners was minimal and often ineffective. A serious injury typically meant the end of a miner's career and livelihood, with no disability support or workers' compensation available. For all these risks and hardships, what was the likely reward? Despite the mythology of the lucky prospector, the vast majority of miners barely earned subsistence wages. By the 1870s, most worked for large mining companies rather than independently, earning $2 to $3 for a grueling 10 to 12-hour day. Studies suggest that storekeepers, saloon owners, and prostitutes consistently made more money than the miners whose dreams sustained frontier mining towns. Speaking of mining towns, they were notoriously rough places. Imagine a community composed primarily of young, single men engaged in dangerous work, with few women, families, or civilizing institutions. Alcohol consumption was astronomical. The average mining camp resident consumed several times more alcohol than the typical American today. Violence was commonplace, with fights, stabbings, and shootings occurring regularly. Sanitation in mining camps was typically abysmal, with minimal planning or infrastructure. Human waste and garbage accumulated in streets and waterways. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread rapidly in these conditions. During warm months, the stench could be overwhelming, and swarms of flies spread disease from waste to food. If you managed to find valuable ore, you faced the challenge of converting it to cash. Banking in the Wild West was primitive and often predatory. Many mining towns had no banks at all, forcing miners to carry gold dust or war, making them targets for theft. Some saloons and general stores offered to buy gold, but frequently at rates far below actual value. Taking advantage of miners' limited options, where banks did exist, they operated with minimal regulation or oversight. Bank failures were common, often wiping out customers' life savings without warning or recourse. Many bankers were little more than confidence men who established storefronts, collected deposits, and disappeared overnight with all the funds. Without federally backed currency, paper money was issued by individual banks, and its value wildly depending on the bank's reputation. Counterfeit bills circulated widely, and even experienced merchants could be fooled by well-made fakes. The safest form of money was gold or silver coin, but carrying it made one a target for robbery. Perhaps after considering the dangers and disappointments of mining, you decide to try your hand at ranching instead. The cattle industry was booming in the 1870s, with demand for beef in eastern cities creating opportunities on the frontier. Surely this would be a healthier, more profitable venture. Ranching did indeed avoid some of the worst health hazards of mining, but it introduced its own unique dangers and hardships. Starting a ranch required significant capital. Land, livestock, equipment, and buildings all represented major investments. Many aspiring ranchers went deeply into debt, purchasing these necessities, betting their future on favorable weather and market conditions. Nature often had other plans. Droughts could wither grazing lands and dry up crucial water sources, forcing ranchers to either watch their cattle starve or sell at devastating losses. Harsh winters could kill entire herds, as happened in the infamous Great Dipe of 1886 to 1887, when up to 90% of cattle on northern ranges froze or starved to death during unusually severe weather. Disease could sweep through herds, wiping out a rancher's investment overnight. Texas fever, anthrax, and other infectious diseases had no effective treatments in the 1870s. Predators like wolves and cougars took a constant toll on livestock, particularly livable calves. Poisonous plants, quicksand, and injuries further reduced herds. The iconic cattle drives, moving herds hundreds of miles to railroad shipping points, were not romantic adventures, but grueling, dangerous undertakings. Cowboys, not the glamorous figures of later films, but typically young, poorly paid laborers, worked 20-hour days during drives, catching brief naps in the saddle as they moved thousands of animals across difficult terrain. These drives faced constant threats. River crossings could turn deadly in minutes if animals panicked, creating deadly pileups that drowned cattle and cowboys alike. Stampedes, which could be triggered by something as simple as a lightning strike or a snapping twig, turned thousands of 1,500-pound animals into an unstoppable, destructive force. Cowboys caught in stampedes were often trampled to death. The cowboy's life was far from the freedom portrayed in Western mythology. They typically earned about $30 per month for exhausting, dangerous work. Most were very young men, often teenagers from poor backgrounds with few other options. A significant percentage were Black, Mexican, or mixed-race individuals facing discrimination that limited their opportunities elsewhere. Their diet on the trail consisted mainly of beans, salt pork, and biscuits, with minimal fresh food. Medical care was limited to whatever the trail cook might know about folk remedies. Injuries common in such dangerous work often went untreated until they became life-threatening. Many cowboys died young from injuries, exposure, or violence. Perhaps ranching doesn't appeal after all. What about farming? Surely growing food, the most fundamental of human activities, would offer a more stable and less dangerous way of life. On the frontier, the Homestead Act of 1862 had opened vast areas of the West to settlement, offering 160 acres free to anyone who would live on and improve the land for 5 years. This seemed like an incredible opportunity, a chance for people with little money to become landowners and build independent livelihoods. The reality proved far more challenging than the promise. First, 160 acres might sound substantial, but in the arid regions that comprised much of the available land, it was often insufficient to support a family. Traditional Eastern farming methods failed in these environments, where rainfall was a fraction of what pioneers were accustomed to. Many settlers had no knowledge of dry farming techniques needed for success in these regions. Starting a frontier farm required tremendous physical labor. The first task was building shelter, typically a sod house on the treeless plains, constructed by cutting and stacking dense prairie turf. These sadies were dark, damp dwellings that leaked when it rained, harbored insects and snakes, and crumbled without constant maintenance. Then came the backbreaking work of breaking the land for planting. prairie sod, held together by dense grass roots that had developed over centuries. Was extraordinarily difficult to plow with the equipment available to most settlers. It could take a year or more just to prepare a few acres for planting. The work was so physically demanding that it permanently damaged many farmers' bodies. Once crops were planted, farmers faced threats from every direction. Drought could wither plants before harvest. Torrential rains could wash away seedlings or flood fields. Early frosts could kill crops just before harvest. Grasshoppers descended in biblical swarms, consuming everything green in their path and sometimes even eating the handles of tools left in fields. Disease affected frontier farmers as it did everyone else, but with particularly devastating consequences. With no hired help and little community support, a family's illness during crucial planting or harvesting periods could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Women often continued working the fields while heavily pregnant or just days after giving birth, risking their health because the work simply couldn't wait. Farm accidents were common and often fatal. Homemade tools broke and caused injuries. Animals panicked and trampled their handlers. Even successful harvest school turned deadly. Numerous farmers died when they fell into grain storage bins and suffocated in the loose grain, or when poorly constructed storage buildings collapsed under the weight of their contents. The isolation of frontier farms took a heavy psychological toll. Neighbors might be miles away, visited only occasionally. Women, in particular, suffered from this isolation, some going months without speaking to anyone outside their immediate family. Depression, anxiety, and what was then called prairie madness affected many settlers, sometimes leading to abandonment of homesteads or suicide. For those who persevered through these challenges and actually produced crops, economic obstacles remained. Transportation to markets was difficult and expensive. Without refrigeration, perishable products had to be sold quickly or preserved. Large agricultural corporations and railroad companies used their influence to keep crop prices low and transportation costs high, squeezing independent farmers from both directions. By the 1870s, another option was emerging on the frontier, working for wages in the growing towns and industries. Perhaps this offered a safer, more stable path than the high-risk ventures of mining, ranching, or farming. Wage labor did avoid some of the worst physical dangers and financial risks of independent enterprises, but introduced its own hardships. Industrial safety standards were virtually non-existent. Workers in frontier factories, mills, and workshops suffered horrific injuries from unguarded machinery. Construction workers built increasingly tall structures without harnesses or safety equipment, leading to frequent fatal falls. Railroad work was particularly dangerous. Track layers worked with minimal equipment under brutal conditions, suffering high rates of injury and death from accidents, heat stroke, and exhaustion. Chinese workers who built much of the transcontinental railroad were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, such as handling unstable explosives to blast through mountain passes. Working hours were long by modern standards, typically 10 to 12 hours per day, 6 days per week. Pay was low, with most workers barely earning subsistence wages. Child labor was common, with children as young as 8 or 9 working alongside adults in many industries, often suffering higher injury rates due to their size and inexperience. Workers had essentially no legal protections. Employers could fire people without cause, reduce wages arbitrarily, or withhold pay entirely. Those who complained or attempted to organize for better conditions faced blacklisting, being marked as troublemakers who no other employer in the region would hire. Company town settlements, where a single employer owned all housing and businesses, were common in mining and lumber regions. Workers in these communities paid inflated prices at company stores, lived in company housing, and sometimes were paid in scrip company currency rather than legal tender. This created a form of debt bondage where workers could never save enough to escape the system. whether you mined, ranched, farmed, or worked for wages. Frontier life shaped your experiences in ways modern people would find disorienting. Perhaps most striking was the relationship with time, not the carefully measured minutes and hours of our digital age, but a more fluid reality governed by daylight, seasons, and natural rhythms. Without electric lighting, most people woke at dawn and slept shortly after sunset, their active hours expanding and contracting with the seasons. Work wasn't measured in 8-hour shifts, but by tasks that needed completion. Fields plowed, cattle moved or extracted. During harvest or roundup, people might work from first light until well after dark for weeks without a break. During winter, many rural workers had periods of relative inactivity when fields lay dormant or cattle needed minimal tending. The concept of punctuality, so central to modern life, had limited relevance on the frontier, with few clocks and limited need for precise timing in most activities. People operated on approximate schedules. Stagecoaches and later trains introduced more precise timetables to the West. But outside these specific contexts, morning or after dinner were sufficiently specific time designations for most purposes. Entertainment and leisure looked nothing like their modern counterparts. After exhausting workdays, most frontier folks had little energy for complex activities. Conversation around the fire, storytelling, or simple card games were common evening pastimes. Music was popular when instruments and skilled players were available, with fiddles, harmonicas, and guitars providing accompaniment for social dances. Reading material was precious and often shared among entire communities. A single book might be read aloud to gatherings of neighbors or passed from family to family until it fell apart from use. Newspapers, when available, were read repeatedly, with every advertisement and notice, scrutinized for information about the wider world. Organized sports existed, but in simpler forms than today. Baseball was gaining popularity, played with minimal equipment on makeshift fields. Horse racing, wrestling, and shooting competitions provided both entertainment and opportunities to demonstrate valuable skills. Children played games that required little or no equipment: tag, hide and seek, and variations of stickball that could be played with found objects. Holidays and community celebrations took on great importance as rare opportunities for socializing and recreation. 4th of July celebrations might draw people from miles around for picnics, speeches, games, and dancing. Harvest festivals marked the successful completion of the year's most critical work. Religious holidays provided both spiritual meaning and welcome breaks from routine. As the day draws to a close, you find yourself reflecting on the relentless challenges of frontier life. Every aspect required harder work, involved greater risk, and offered fewer comforts than its modern equivalent. The people who survived, and sometimes thrived, in these conditions possessed qualities that modern society rarely deems extraordinary. Physical endurance, practical skills applicable to countless emergencies, and psychological resilience in the face of constant hardship and loss. The darkness gathers once more, and with it comes a silence profound enough to hear your own heartbeat. No car engines, no air conditioners, no electronic hums, just the whisper of wind, the chorus of insects, and the occasional call of night birds. This profound quiet, so alien to modern ears, was the soundtrack of frontier nights, sometimes comforting, sometimes unsettling in its emptiness. As you drift towards sleep, you wonder if you would have had what it took to survive here, not just for a day or a week, but for years and decades. The people who shaped the American West, for better and worse, were not the idealized heroes of later fiction, but complex individuals facing extraordinary challenges with the limited resources and knowledge of their time. Their story, stripped of romanticism, is one of human endurance against conditions that would break many of us today. The cool night air settles around you like a blanket, and the stars emerge in a display of brilliance impossible to see in our light-polluted modern world. This, at least, is one pure beauty the people of the frontier experienced that few today can fully appreciate: the majestic sweep of the Milky Way across a truly dark sky, connecting them to the same cosmic panorama their ancestors had watched for countless generations. Morning arrives again in the Wild West, and with it comes hunger, a constant companion on the frontier. Food in the 1870s West bore little resemblance to the varied, convenient diet you're accustomed to in the modern world. Let's explore what keeping yourself fed would actually entail in this harsh environment. The good news is that game was still relatively plentiful in many areas. Deer, elk, rabbit, and various birds could supplement your diet if you had the skills to hunt them. The bad news: hunting required ammunition, which was expensive and might be needed for protection. It also demanded time away from other essential work, making it a luxury many settlers couldn't afford during busy seasons. Most frontier families relied heavily on foods they could grow, preserve, or purchase in bulk. The staples of the frontier diet were beans, corn, and pork, dense in calories, but monotonous and nutritionally incomplete. Fresh fruits and vegetables were available only in season, a few months at most, and winter diets often contained no fresh produce whatsoever. This lack of dietary variety led to widespread nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was common during winter and early spring when no fresh produce was available. The symptoms: bleeding gums, loosening teeth, joint pain, and eventually death were well known but difficult to prevent with available resources. Other deficiency diseases affected growth in children and caused various chronic health problems. In adults, food preservation was a constant challenge and critical survival skill. Without refrigeration, meat needed to be consumed quickly or preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. These methods deterred bacterial growth but drastically changed flavors and textures while reducing nutritional value. The heavy salt content of preserved foods contributed to high blood pressure and other health issues. Women spent enormous amounts of time preserving food when it was abundant for use during scarce periods. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or fermented. Fruits were dried or preserved with sugar if available. Root vegetables might be stored in root cellars, underground spaces that maintained cool temperatures. These preservation efforts were not optional activities, but essential survival work that could determine whether a family would eat during winter. Food storage presented its own problems. Properly prepared preserved foods could last months, or even years, but improper techniques led to spoilage and potentially deadly food poisoning. Additionally, stored food attracted pests. Rats, mice, and insects consumed portions of most stored food supplies, and their droppings contaminated what remained. Most frontier families simply accepted a certain amount of insect parts and rodent droppings in their flour, beans, and other staples as unavoidable. Cooking itself was far more labor-intensive than modern people can easily comprehend. Meals were prepared over open hearths or wood-burning stoves that required constant attention and fuel. In wood-scarce prairie regions, women and children might spend hours gathering buffalo chips, dried manure, or twisted grass to burn as cooking fuel. Water had to be hauled from wells or streams, often hundreds of pounds per day, for cooking, cleaning, and drinking. Even with these efforts, meals lacked the variety and flavor profiles modern people expect. Spices were expensive luxuries, used sparingly, if at all. Sugar and coffee were treasured items, often hoarded for special occasions. Fresh milk was available only if a family kept a cow, and for only part of the year when the cow was producing. Most frontier children grew up with simple, repetitive diets that would horrify modern nutritionists. Interestingly, despite these limitations, obesity was rare on the frontier. The combination of limited food supplies, minimal sugar consumption, and constant physical labor kept most people lean. However, this leanness wasn't necessarily healthy. Many frontier folks suffered from malnutrition even when they had sufficient calories to sustain their work. Beyond basic survival needs, Like food, frontier life presented unique challenges for families raising children. If you had been born in the Wild West, rather than just visiting it, your childhood would have been dramatically different from modern experiences. Childhood itself was conceived differently in the 19th century. Children as young as 6 or 7 were expected to contribute meaningful work to family survival, not as educational chores, but as essential economic contributions. Young children minded livestock, gathered eggs, picked vegetables, watched younger siblings, and helped with countless other tasks that freed adults for heavier work. By age 10 or 12, most frontier children worked alongside adults at nearly adult capacity. Boys followed fathers into fields, barns, or workshops, learning skills through direct participation rather than formal instruction. Girls worked with mothers, learning the complex domestic skills necessary for frontier homemaking. Not simple housekeeping, but the production of essential goods like clothing, preserved food, candles, and soap. This early adulthood extended to other areas. Oft-life children were not sheltered from the harsh realities around them. They witnessed births, deaths, the slaughtering of animals, and the sometimes violent conflicts of frontier communities. They were expected to understand and adapt to these realities, rather than being protected from them. Education, as modern people understand it, was limited and inconsistent on the frontier. In established towns, schools might operate for a few months each year, typically during winter, when agricultural work was minimal. One teacher, often barely educated themselves, might be responsible for students ranging from 5 to 17 years old, all studying in a single room. Physical conditions in these schools were challenging. Buildings were poorly insulated, leading to freezing conditions in winter and stifling heat in warmer months. Supplies were minimal, perhaps a few shared textbooks, slates for writing that had to be constantly erased and reused, and minimal paper that was treated as a precious resource. Corporal punishment was the standard disciplinary approach, with whipping or beatings administered for infractions as minor as whispering or failing to memorize assigned material. In more remote areas, formal schooling might not exist at all. Some families conducted home education using whatever books were available, but many frontier children received only the most basic literacy and calculation skills, if that. Their education focused instead on practical knowledge: how to predict weather, track animals, prepare soil for planting, treat common injuries, and perform the countless other tasks essential for survival. Child mortality remained devastatingly high throughout the frontier period. Approximately 1 in 4 children died before reaching adulthood, with the highest risk in the first 5 years of life. Diseases that modern medicine easily prevents or treats: measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping, co-frequently killed or permanently disabled young children. Accidents claimed many more, as child safety was a foreign concept in an era where survival demanded risk-taking. The psychological impact of this mortality on both children and parents is difficult for modern people to comprehend. Most children grew up watching siblings die. Parents expected to lose children and often gave the same name to a subsequent child if an older sibling died. A practice that seems strange today, but reflected the different relationship with mortality in an era when death was an everyday presence. Perhaps nothing illustrates the gulf between frontier and modern life more clearly than approaches to health and medicine. If you became ill or injured in the 1870s West, your experience would bear almost no resemblance to modern healthcare. The first difference would be the absence of professional medical care in most situations. Doctors were scarce, with many communities having none at all. Those who did practice on the frontier often had minimal training, perhaps a brief apprenticeship or a few months at a medical college. Their knowledge reflected medical science of the era, which still relied heavily on theories like humoral balance, that had more in common with medieval medicine than modern practice. Without access to professional care, most health issues were addressed through home remedies and folk medicine. Every community had people, usually women, known for their healing skills, drawing on traditions brought from various cultures. Some of these treatments, particularly herbal remedies, had genuine medicinal properties, but many were ineffective or actively harmful. Common medical treatments of the era included bloodletting, which weakened already ill patients, purgatives that caused severe diarrhea, supposedly to expel bad humors, and poultices of various substances applied to wounds, some of which introduced infection rather than preventing it. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was widely used for pain, leading to addiction in many cases. Mercury compounds were prescribed for numerous conditions, despite their toxicity, even when treatments had some validity. Impure medications caused problems. Without pharmaceutical regulations or standardization, commercially sold medicines varied wildly in potency and often contained dangerous contaminants. Many patent medicines marketed as cure-alls contained primarily alcohol, providing temporary relief through intoxication rather than addressing underlying conditions. Surgery under frontier conditions was particularly horrific. Without effective anesthesia beyond alcohol, whiskey, or opium, patients endured excruciating pain during procedures. Sterilization was unknown or inconsistently practiced, leading to rampant post-surgical infections. Amputation was the standard treatment for serious limb injuries, performed with saws and knives that might be wiped clean but never properly sterilized. Childbirth represented perhaps the starkest contrast between frontier and modern medical experiences. Women typically gave birth at home, attended by a midwife if one was available, or female relatives if not. Without prenatal care, many complications weren't identified until labor was underway. Breech births, hemorrhage, and other emergencies that modern medicine handles routinely often resulted in the death of mother, child, or both. Maternal mortality rates on the frontier were approximately 1 death per 100 births, more than 100 times higher than in developed countries today. Many women approached each pregnancy knowing it might be their last experience in life. Men's diaries and letters from the period frequently mention the heartbreaking reality of raising children alone after losing wives in childbirth. The combined impact of inadequate nutrition, constant physical strain, minimal preventive care, and primitive treatment options meant that frontier populations experienced health outcomes more similar to developing nations today than to modern America. Life expectancy at birth was under 40 years, with those surviving childhood likely to suffer chronic health problems by their 50s if they lived that long. Beyond these material hardships, frontier life imposed a form of isolation and disconnection that modern people, accustomed to instant global communication, would find almost unbearable. This isolation shaped frontier psychology and culture in profound ways. Communication with distant family or friends occurred at the speed of physical transportation. Letters took weeks or months to reach recipients, if they arrived at all. News traveled slowly and unreliably, often distorted through retelling. Major events might not become known in remote areas until months after they occurred. This information vacuum contributed to a highly localized worldview, where distant events seemed abstract and irrelevant compared to immediate community concerns. The isolation was particularly difficult for those accustomed to more settled environments. Women who had grown up with close female friendships and family networks often found themselves alone for days or weeks, while husbands traveled for supplies or work. Their diaries frequently mention crippling loneliness and the psychological strain of having no adult conversation for extended periods. This isolation sometimes led to what contemporary accounts called prairie madness, severe depression, anxiety, and occasionally psychosis, triggered by the combination of isolation, constant work, and environmental hardships. Some affected individuals became violent toward family members or committed suicide. Others simply abandoned their homesteads and returned east, unable to endure the psychological pressure of frontier life. Even in established communities, Social connections were limited by practical constraints. Visiting neighbors might require traveling several miles each way, a significant undertaking when time was precious and transportation limited to walking or horseback. Formal social gatherings were infrequent, typically centered around church services, seasonal celebrations, or community work events like barn raisings or harvest festivals. Churches played a crucial role in frontier communities beyond their spiritual function. They served as social hubs, educational centers, and mutual aid societies. Even those with limited religious conviction often participated in church activities for the community connection they provided. Religious leaders, ministers, priests, or lay preachers frequently took on roles far beyond religious guidance, serving as teachers, dispute mediators, and community organizers. The establishment of community institutions marked important milestones in frontier development. Building a school, church, or meeting hall represented a commitment to permanent settlement rather than temporary exploitation. These institutions helped transform mining camps or trading posts into towns with collective identities and shared futures. The creation of local governments, rudimentary as they often were, similarly marked transitions from frontier chaos to established community. Frontier communities also developed distinctive forms of mutual aid and collective action necessary for survival in harsh conditions. Barn raisings and house raisings allowed families to complete large construction projects impossible for individual households. Harvest teams moved from farm to farm, ensuring crops were gathered before weather could destroy them. Spontaneous search parties formed when children went missing. These cooperative traditions reflected the practical reality that no individual or family could survive the frontier entirely through self-reliance. This community interdependence existed alongside the individualism that later became mythologized in frontier narratives. Both elements were necessary responses to frontier conditions: self-reliance for daily survival, community cooperation for challenges beyond individual capacity. The tension between these values shaped frontier culture and continues to influence American attitudes toward government, community, and individual responsibility. As another day in the Wild West draws to a close, you find yourself contemplating the mental and emotional resilience required to endure such conditions year after year. The people who populated the American frontier weren't superhuman. They suffered, struggled, and sometimes broke under the relentless pressure of their environment. But many adapted and persevered, developing skills and perspectives that allowed them to find meaning and even joy amid hardship. The darkness settles around you once more, bringing with it the profound silence of the pre-industrial night. The day's experiences have given you a glimpse into a world, both familiar and utterly alien. A world where survival required constant vigilance, where comfort was rare and luxury almost non-existent, where death was an everyday companion rather than a distant stranger. As sleep approaches, you wonder about the people who chose this life, or had it thrust upon them by circumstance. What drove them west? What sustained them through blizzards, droughts, illness, and loss? What would they think of the world there? Struggles helped create a world of abundance and security beyond anything they could have imagined, built on foundations they laid through exhausting labor and countless sacrifices. The questions follow you into dreams filled with endless prairies, towering mountains, and the faces of those who tamed the Wild West, not through romantic gunfights, but through the quiet heroism of daily persistence against overwhelming odds. Their story, stripped of Hollywood glamour and frontier mythology, stands as a testament to human adaptability and the extraordinary courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Dawn breaks on what will be your final day in the Wild West, as the golden light spills across the landscape. You take a moment to appreciate the raw beauty that drew so many westward. Despite the dangers and hardships, the frontier was a place of stunning natural grandeur. Vast prairies rippling like oceans, mountains scraping the sky, canyons plunging into the earth's depths. This beauty, at least, wasn't a Hollywood invention. But even this relationship with the natural world differed profoundly from modern environmental perspectives. The frontier mentality viewed nature primarily as a resource to be conquered and exploited rather than preserved or protected. Timber was cut without consideration for regeneration. Game was hunted to the edge of extinction in many regions. Streams were diverted, polluted, or destroyed for mining operations with no thought for downstream consequences. The near extinction of the American bison buffalo stands as perhaps the starkest example of this exploitative approach. In the 1700s, an estimated 30 to 60 million bison roamed North America. By 1884, fewer than 1,000 remained. This devastation wasn't simply the result of hunting for food or hides, though that played a part. It was also deliberate policy, encouraged by the U.S. government as a way to deprive Plains Indian tribes of their primary resource, forcing them onto reservations. General Philip Sheridan, a key military leader in the Plains Indian Wars, reportedly stated, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated. It is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." Whether or not he actually spoke these exact words, they accurately reflect government policy of the era. The destruction of the buffalo herds was environmental warfare, designed to break indigenous resistance by eliminating their way of life. For Native American nations across the West, the expansion of white settlement represented an apocalypse, not just physical displacement, but the collapse of economic systems, spiritual practices, and cultural identities tied to specific landscapes and resources. While early interactions sometimes involved trade and cooperation, by the 1870s, most indigenous groups faced stark choices: confinement on reservations, continued resistance against overwhelming odds, or cultural assimilation. The reservation system itself represented a form of cultural genocide. Native children were forcibly removed from families and sent to boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. As Captain Richard H. Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, infamously stated, "These children had their hair cut short, were forbidden from speaking their languages, practicing their religions, or maintaining their cultural identities." The intergenerational trauma from these policies continues to affect Native communities today. Armed resistance against American expansion almost invariably ended in defeat, though some groups maintained independence longer than others. The Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where combined Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces defeated Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry, represented one of the last major indigenous victories. The subsequent military campaigns against these tribes were marked by increasing brutality, including attacks on villages and the killing of women and children. The tragedy of this cultural collision was heightened by the fact that many Native nations had sophisticated agricultural systems, complex governance structures, and rich cultural traditions that could have offered valuable knowledge to European settlers. The different approaches to land use and ownership create fundamental misunderstandings. Many Native groups couldn't conceive of owning land any more than one could own the air or stars, making treaty negotiations over territory fundamentally problematic from the start. These cultural conflicts extended beyond Native-white relations. The West was extraordinarily diverse, with communities from around the world bringing different languages, religions, customs, and approaches to frontier life. This diversity was both a strength, introducing varied skills and perspectives, and a source of tension in communities struggling with scarce resources and limited infrastructure. Chinese immigrants, who played crucial roles in building the transcontinental railroad and developing mining operations, faced particularly severe discrimination. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major American law restricting immigration based on nationality, grew from anti-Chinese sentiment that had festered for decades in Western territories. Chinese miners were frequently driven from productive claims, through violence or unjust application of foreign miners' taxes. Chinese communities in frontier towns often faced riots and mass expulsions when economic conditions deteriorated. Mexican Americans, many of whom had become U.S. citizens through territorial acquisition rather than immigration, similarly faced discrimination and displacement. Despite treaty guarantees protecting property rights following the Mexican War, many Mexican landowners saw their holdings taken through legal manipulation, intimidation, or outright fraud. Spanish-derived water right systems that had functioned effectively for generations were replaced with English common law approaches less suited to arid environments. Even European immigrants found that national and religious identities continued to matter on the frontier. Irish Catholics, German Lutherans, Scandinavian Protestants, Eastern European Jewish group tended to establish distinct communities and maintained cultural practices from their homelands. These communities provide a mutual support but sometimes became targets for nativist sentiment when economic or social tensions arose. African Americans who moved west after the Civil War hoped to find freedom from Southern oppression but often encountered different forms of discrimination. Black cowboys, who made up approximately 25% of the workforce on some cattle operations, rarely received recognition in contemporary accounts or later mythology. Black homesteaders established communities in several Western territories, but frequently faced organized resistance from white neighbors and discriminatory application of homestead laws. The collision of these diverse groups, each with their own values, practices, and expectations, created frontier communities far more complex and conflict-ridden than later romantic depictions would suggest. The melting pot metaphor popularized in later American mythology obscured both the persistent cultural distinctiveness of various groups and the power imbalances that determined whose cultures would be preserved and whose would be suppressed. As the day progresses, you find yourself in a frontier town undergoing rapid transformation, a transition happening across the West during the 1870s and 1880s, the initial phase of settlement, characterized by individual prospectors, independent farmers, and small-scale enterprises, was giving way to more organized, corporate development of Western resources. The arrival of railroads catalyzed this transition. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, dramatically reduced travel time between east and west from months to days. Subsequent branch lines penetrated previously isolated regions, connecting them to national markets and supply chains. This transportation revolution allowed large-scale extraction of Western resources for Eastern factories and enabled mass-produced Eastern goods to flood Western markets. These economic connections accelerated the integration of Western regions into national systems but often disadvantaged small producers. Independent miners couldn't compete with large mining corporations that brought industrial methods and capital investment. Family farms struggled against agricultural enterprises operating on vast acreage. Small ranchers found themselves squeezed by cattle companies with investor backing and political connections. Corporate interests increasingly dominated political as well as economic structures. Railroad companies, mining conglomerates, timber interests, and large landholders exercised enormous influence over territorial and early state governments. Water rights, mineral claims, grazing access, and timber concessions were allocated through processes that typically favored those with financial and political power rather than small operators or community interests. This transition from frontier to integrated region wasn't simply economic, but cultural. The rough-edged mining camp or cattle town gradually acquired institutions that signaled permanence and connection to wider society: banks, schools, churches, newspapers, theaters, and fraternal organizations. Streets were surveyed and paved wooden structures were replaced with brick and stone buildings. Local governments enacted ordinances regulating behavior that had previously gone ungoverned. For many who had been attracted to the frontier precisely because of its freedom from Eastern constraints, these changes represented unwelcome domestication of the wild spaces they had sought. Some continually moved westward ahead of advancing civilization, seeking new frontiers. Others struggled to adapt to increasing regulation, competition, and social The mythological end of the frontier, declared in the 1890 census, represented real psychological and cultural challenges for those whose identities were tied to frontier conditions. Part of this transformation involved the taming, or at least management, of frontier violence. The iconic gunfighters and outlaws, who would later dominate Western mythology, operated in a specific historical window when formal law enforcement was establishing itself against pre-existing systems of personal and community violence by the 1880s and 1890s. Professional police forces and court systems had replaced vigilante justice in most established communities, though remote areas still saw occasional eruptions of frontier-style conflict resolution. The legendary figures who captured public imagination, Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, Jesse James, appeared in this transitional period, often moving back and forth between legal and illegal activities as circumstances changed. Their later mythologization obscured the complex, often morally ambiguous reality of their lives. Hickok, far from the perfect marksman of legend, shot bystanders in at least 2 gunfights. Earp worked variously as a lawman, gambler, brothel keeper, and vigilante across his career. The Robin Hood image attached to Jesse James ignored his Confederate guerrilla background and the innocent victims of his robberies. As evening approaches on your final day in the Wild West, you find yourself contemplating the gap between frontier reality and the mythology that would later emerge from it. Why did Americans, and eventually the world, become so fascinated with a romanticized version of this brutal period? What needs did these myths serve, and what truths did they obscure? Part of the answer lies in timing. The most intense period of frontier mythology making occurred precisely as the actual frontier was disappearing. The Wild West shows of Buffalo Bill Cody began in the 1880s, featuring staged reenactments of Indian battles and stagecoach robberies for Eastern audiences. Even as railroads, telegraph lines, and formal governance were integrating Western regions into mainstream American society. These performances weren't meant as accurate historical recreations, but as entertainment that resonated with Eastern ideas about the West. The dime novels that popularized exaggerated tales of Western heroes originated not on the frontier but in Eastern publishing houses, written by authors who rarely had first-hand experience of the regions they described. These formulaic stories emphasized action, clear moral distinctions between heroes and villains, and a vision of the West as a testing ground for American virtues of self-reliance, courage, and individualism. Later, Hollywood westerns further refined and amplified these mythological elements, creating iconic images of lone cowboys, heroic sheriffs, dastardly outlaws, and savage Indians that bore little resemblance to historical reality. These films served psychological and cultural functions beyond entertainment. They offered reassuring narratives about Amory Canadenti during periods of rapid social change and international challenges. The mythology suggested that American character had been forged in frontier conditions, producing exceptional qualities that distinguished the nation from older societies. It implied that American expansion across the continent had been not just inevitable, but morally justified, a triumph of civilization over wilderness and progress over primitive cultures. It presented simplified moral frameworks where good invariably triumphed over evil through righteous violence, justifying America's growing military and economic power on the world stage. What these myths obscured was the complex, morally ambiguous reality of Western development, the genocide of indigenous peoples, the exploitation of immigrant labor, the environmental devastation, the corporate manipulation of political systems, and the deeply divided communities struggling with fundamental questions about identity, governance, and resources. The real West offered no simple moral lessons but rather a case study in how human societies adapt to challenging conditions. sometimes showing remarkable cooperation and creativity, sometimes descending into exploitation and brutality. As darkness falls once more, you reflect on your brief journey through the unromanticized Wild West. You've experienced firsthand why the average person today, accustomed to abundant food, medical care, physical safety, and countless comforts, unknown to frontier dwellers, would likely not survive even a single day in the actual conditions of the 1870s frontier. The skills, knowledge, physical conditioning, and psychological resilience required for frontier survival represent a way of life so distant from modern experience as to be almost unimaginable. Yet, something about this world continues to fascinate us. Perhaps it's the raw honesty of a life stripped to essentials, where tasks have immediate consequences and achievements represent tangible victories against natural constraints. Perhaps it's the community interdependence that emerged from shared challenges, creating connections that transcended differences in background or belief. Perhaps it's simply the reminder that human beings can endure and even find meaning in conditions far harsher than most of us will ever face. The legacy of the American frontier extends beyond mythology into the actual structures and systems that shape modern American life. Property laws, water rights, frameworks, federal-state relationships, approaches to natural resources, and countless other aspects of American governance emerged from frontier-era compromises and conflicts. The diversity of Western communities, despite efforts at forced assimilation, contributed to the multicultural reality of modern America. Even the continuing tensions between individual rights and collective welfare, local control and national standards, exploitation and conservation have roots in frontier-era debates. For indigenous peoples, the frontier era represents not a glorious chapter in national expansion, but the devastation of ancient lifeways and the beginning of a long struggle for cultural survival and sovereignty that continues today. Their perspective reminds us that the simple, triumphalist narrative of Western settlement ignores the complex civilizations that already existed and the incalculable knowledge lost through their disruption. The most accurate understanding of the frontier requires holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, acknowledging both the courage of those who built new communities in challenging conditions and the devastation experienced by those displaced by this expansion. As you drift towards sleep on your final night in the Wild West, the sounds of this earlier America surround you. The whisper of wind through prairie grass, the distant howl of coyotes, perhaps the faint piano notes from a saloon down the street. These sensory experiences, at least, connected all who lived through this era. Regardless of background or circumstance, the vast skies, extreme weather, imposing landscapes, and profound silences shaped everyone who encountered them, creating a shared relationship with the environment, even amid cultural conflicts. Tomorrow, you'll return to your own time, carrying with you a deeper understanding of this pivotal period in American history. You'll never again see a Western film or read a frontier novel without recognizing the sanitized, simplified version of a complex reality. You'll appreciate the extraordinary comfort and security of modern life, achieved through technological advances unimaginable to frontier dwellers. You might find yourself more aware of the skills and knowledge lost in the transition to our specialized, technology-dependent society. The practical self-sufficiency that allowed frontier people to build, repair, grow, preserve, and create what they needed with minimal outside support. Most importantly, you'll understand that the real story of the American West isn't found in gunfights and gold strikes, but in the daily struggles of ordinary people, men, women, and children of diverse backgrounds who faced extraordinary challenges with the limited resource available to them. Their story, without Hollywood embellishment, contains enough genuine courage, tragedy, innovation, conflict, cooperation, cruelty, and kindness to fill countless histories. Their legacy lives in the communities they established, the environmental changes they initiated, the cultural patterns they created, and the myths that grew from their experiences. The real Wild West disappeared long ago, transformed by technology, population growth, economic integration, and environmental change into the modern American West of cities, suburbs, highways, and managed landscapes. Yet, echoes of frontier experience persist in regional identities, local traditions, land use patterns, and governance structures. The memory of this formative period continues to influence how Americans understand themselves and their nation's development, even as scholars and communities work to replace simplistic mythology with more accurate, inclusive understandings of this complex history. As you finally surrender to sleep, the boundary between past and present seems to blur. The challenges faced by frontier communities adapting to environmental constraints, managing scarce resources, building functional communities among diverse populations, balancing individual freedom with collective needs, remain relevant in new forms today. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the frontier experience is not a set of answers, but a collection of questions about human adaptation, community formation, and the relationship between people and the natural world, questions each generation missed answer anew as circumstances change. The stars shine brilliantly above, the same stars that guided travelers across the prairie, helped farmers time their planting, and gave comfort to homesick immigrants far from familiar landscapes. In this moment of connection across time, you feel a fleeting kinship with those who looked upon these same constellations a century and a half ago, wondering what tomorrow would bring in a world where survival was never guaranteed, but life, in all its harshness and beauty, was experienced with an intensity seldom matched in our more comfortable era. Sleep comes at last, and with it, dreams of a West both harsh and magnificent, a place where human vulnerability and resilience were displayed in equal measure, where diverse peoples collided and sometimes cooperated in ways that would shape a nation, and where the daily struggle for existence contained moments of transcendent connection with landscapes of breathtaking grandeur. The real Wild West, stripped of romantic illusion, offers a window into human experience, at its most elemental, challenging, frightening, and occasionally sublime.